Hello, thank you for joining us today. This webinar series has been convened by the Critical Zone Network, Early Career Network, in partnership with the Critical Zone Collaborative Network. This is the first series of a number of series that the CZN Early Career Network has planned, all with the goal of enhancing collaboration and synthesis across CZ Observatory and Watershed sites. Welcome to the fourth week of this Cyberseminar Series, Introduction to Critical Zone Observatories and Watershed Sites. This is a 6-part series and will continue each week at this time until September 28th. To view the previous webinars in this series, I'd encourage you to visit the CUAHSI YouTube channel where they can all be found. I'll put a link in the chat to that in a moment if you've missed out on any in our previous 3 weeks. But my name is Julia Masterman. I'm the Education and Outreach Specialist for CUAHSI. CUAHSI is a consortium of universities for the advancement of hydrologic science, and our mission is to advance water science by strengthening interdisciplinary collaboration, providing critical infrastructure through our data services, and promoting education in water science at all levels. CUAHSI also serves as the national coordinating hub for the Critical Zone Collaborative Network, or CZCN, and we're very thankful to the members of the CZ Network team for the contributions to the series and for all of our speakers and facilitators for the series. I'd encourage you to reach out or visit our website to sign up for our newsletter or join our community Slack channel to learn more about CUAHSI or get involved. I'll add information to those things in the chat in just a moment. A few logistical things before I pass things off to our conveners and facilitators this series. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the CUAHSI YouTube channel later this afternoon. Secondly, we ask that you use the Q&A functionality to submit questions to our panelists. Feel free to do that throughout the session today. And finally, we expect that all involved with CUAHSI Cyberseminars promote and maintain a professional, considerate, respectful, and collaborative virtual environment. So thank you for being a part of that. Thank you again for joining us, and to the CZN Early Career Network for putting together a fantastic lineup of presentations for this series, and to all of our presenters today for taking the time to join us today from all over the world. Today's session is about landscapes disturbed by drought and or wildfire. And with that, I'll pass the mic to CZN Early Career Network Steering Committee member and research scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, Bhavna Arora, for some updates from the CZN Early Career Network.
Thanks, Julia. Can I share my screen? Perfect. So welcome everyone to week 4. We are going to be talking today about landscapes under disturbance with an acute focus on droughts and wildfire. And I'm very excited to learn about these individual sites that span, from the international domain, basically going from North America to Europe and Chinese sites as well. 2 quick updates from this team. One is that we do have a special issue call out for papers, thinking about the future of critical zone science towards shared goals, tools, approaches, and philosophy. And the submission deadline for that is next year, 31st March 2022. We are accepting papers in water sources research and Earth's future. And then the other thing that this team is doing is hosting an AGU workshop that's geared towards enhancing the early career network, again, on an international domain. The deadline for registering for that workshop is November 1st, and there are some funding opportunities available for graduate students in early careers through the CUAHSI network. So again, the goal of the series is in concert with, both of these opportunities, which is really to enhance opportunities or think more about synthesis and integration across the various watershed and critical zone network sites. And with that, I want to pass this on to Claire.
Thanks so much, Bhavna. Welcome, everybody. Glad that you could join us today. I will quickly pass it over to my co-lead, Jonas, but before we do that, I just wanted to give a little bit of context for the topic of today's cyber seminar. When the steering committee was brainstorming different topics for this series, we were very interested in the idea of landscapes under disturbance. And of course, there are so many disturbances these days that are impacting our watersheds and our observatories. We considered other disturbances like urbanization and resource extraction. But considering sort of current events around the world right now, we thought that drought and wildfire would be of particular interest to a lot of our audience. And so those are the two that we focused on, but just wanted to acknowledge that, of course, these are not the only disturbances happening right now. Thanks so much.
Okay, we have today 5 lectures, and I would like to introduce William Quinton. He's a professor at the Wilfred Laurier University in Waterloo. William, you have the floor.
Okay, thanks, Denis. I'll just share my screen. Just to confirm, you can see my screen, I hope.
Yes.
Okay, there we go. Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm going to talk about the Scotty Creek Research Station. Now, I realize that the focus of today's seminar is on drought and wildfire. But those haven't been particularly prominent at Scotty Creek over the last few decades. So I was given permission to talk about factors that, how the landscape at Scotty is dramatically changing and how that in turn might change its susceptibility to fire and drought. So Scotty Creek is located in the southern part of the Northwest Territories. It's about 50 kilometers south of the confluence of the Liard and the Mackenzie rivers. It drains an area of about 150 square kilometers of high boreal forest and wetland. Our studies are mainly focused and have been focused since 1999 in the headwaters near a place called Goose Lake. And the basin has been gauged since 1996. Now, excuse me, Scotty Creek's also in a region of the Northwest Territories called the Dehcho. And the Dehcho region occupies the southern margin of discontinuous permafrost. It also occupies an area of the Northwest Territories that has warmed significantly over recent decades. And for that reason, we often refer to this, the Dehcho region, as the front lines of permafrost thaw. It's where permafrost isn't only thawing, it's literally disappearing from the landscape. And that's of great concern to the communities in the region. And Scotty Creek, being nestled in amongst the communities, is well positioned to engage with them on all things permafrost, mitigation, adaptation, and processes, and so on. So we base a lot of that work out of the station shown here. It consists of a number of semi-permanent buildings. There's plumbing, heating, electrical systems. There's Wi-Fi. We operate throughout the summer as well as during the winter. And if you were to walk to the edge of town here, you would get to the trailhead of about 5 kilometers of GeoRunner pathways or boardwalks. And we use a color-coded system, lots of "You Are Here" maps, and that's because we engage heavily with local communities, and we don't want to have, young ones or elders lost on the landscape, or me lost on the landscape. So if you're walking along the GeoRunner, you'll find, a large number of meteorological stations, such as shown here. I think there's 20 or so, including a flux tower shown down the bottom right, and infrastructure, hydrological infrastructure shown over here in the top left. And at any one time, you'll find a number of experiments going on, such as shown over in the bottom left. Now, if you're interested in what's going on at Scotty Creek, you can go to the scottycreek.com and click on the map, and any one of the symbols on the map, and that'll give you the metadata, what's happening where. I don't have a lot of time, of course, to go over all of the details of what is being collected data-wise, but just a couple of examples. Here's snow survey data that we've, in this example for forest and wetland since 2006. Radiation data, incoming and outgoing short and long wave, again, for different land cover types, averaged over several I guess a couple of decades. Now, in this landscape, forest represents permafrost. It tells us where the permafrost is. So when permafrost below the forest thaws, the forest above it disappears as well. And that happens quite dramatically, as seen in comparing the bottom two photos, 2003 on the left to 17 years later on the right, where there's no permafrost to be found here anymore. That's about 50 meters, 50 or 60 meters across. And this correspondence between forest and coverage and permafrost coverage has enabled us to map out the distribution of permafrost by proxy with the forest cover over, since mid last century, essentially. And hydrologically, what's of interest and importance here is that it's essentially opened up the landscape. So the yellow is permafrost, and the green, a lot of the green areas were formerly impounded by permafrost, but have over the years become hydrologically connected to the basin drainage network. And that means that water is able to escape, flow away from areas that were previously impounded, either by new talic layers shown here on the left here, which conduct water all throughout the year, or by new overland flow paths, as shown between these two wetlands here. And it turns out that we can go back to our water level recorders that we've had distributed over the landscape over the years, and see if we can detect water level change. And sure enough, there has been very clear dewatering, of the landscape over the years as a result of introduction of these new drainage pathways. And that has implications for basin drainage in the region. In this example, we're looking at two average decadal hydrographs, one for the 70s and 80s and the other ones for a recent decade. In the earlier one, we see the runoff ratio, that is the proportion of precipitation that's translated into runoff, was only about a quarter, whereas now about half the runoff, half the precipitation runs off. So anyway, studying these different types of processes has enabled us to put together conceptual models, and they've formed the basis of numerical descriptions of the same. We've also gone outside of Scotty Creek to see if the changes that we've observed within Scotty Creek are occurring throughout the region. And NASA above has helped us with that, flying transects over these study sites down into the northeastern BC. And that's enabled us to understand the stages of land cover change and the processes involved in moving us from one stage to the next. You can imagine that these stages would have introduce a different fire and drought environment. So as I mentioned earlier, we work closely with local communities on such things as co-developing research questions. We work with communities on implementing field courses on the land camps. We do that throughout the year in the winter and in the summer as well. And a lot of these activities are outside, of course, but we also have increased capacity to do indoor activities, some laboratory work and so on with the students. The community members often come to Scotty Creek for a variety of engagement activities and events. And likewise, we go into the communities for a number of events, including in this case, a mapping workshop. We also work just outside the communities on training students and guardians on monitoring techniques, as in this case. Okay, I'll just end here, but I want to extend a big thank you to the Decho Guardians. I think a lot of our community engagement really paid off during COVID, because we were locked out of the territories, but the Decho Guardians really, they jumped into the driver's seat and kept Scotty going, ran all the operations, and they did a great job. So thank you to them, and thank you to you for your attention.
Thank you very much, William, for your presentation. The next presenter is Andrew Ireson. He's an associate professor at the University of Saskatchewan. Please go ahead, Andrew.
Thank you. Scramble to get ready here. I'm sorry. Is that okay? Is that working? So thanks very much for the invitation to speak to you today. I'm Andrew Ireson from the University of Saskatchewan. I'm here on Treaty 6 territory, homeland of the First Nations and the Métis in the Canadian Prairies. And I'm going to talk to you about, basically, I want to introduce you to a site called Saint Denis in the Prairies, and sort of expose you to the data that we've been collecting at this site for many years. This is work put together by myself and Rosa Brannan, who I work with. So basically, Saint Denis is or the prairies are a seasonally frozen semi-arid environment, and they're the breadbasket of Canada where most of the crops are produced. It's an area that contains thousands of small depressions in which wetlands and ponds form, so they're everywhere. And Saint Denis is in the middle of the prairies, and it's a really nice long-term observatory of the hydrological system. And so if we look at the data record from Saint Denis, what we'll see is a very dramatic climate variability. So again, here's North America. The sort of light green area in Canada here is the prairies, and it's bounded to the west by the Rocky Mountains, the north by the Boreal Forest, the east by Lake Winnipeg, and the south by the US border with Montana and North Dakota. And so there's a river basin called the Saskatchewan River Basin that drains the Rocky Mountains through the prairies to Lake Winnipeg. And if we just sort of go into the middle, you've got City of Saskatoon where I am, and Saint Denis just 40 kilometers to the east. Here's Saint Denis. It's a national wildlife research area that's just at the bottom of this 10 square kilometer watershed, very small watershed. And the watershed drains to what we call a terminal pond. So the water that ends up at the bottom of that watershed never leaves this area, and it only evaporates back up to the atmosphere. It's a very hilly area, as you can see from the topography, and there are hundreds of these depressions with ponds and wetlands. System is snowmelt dominated, so it's a relatively dry site with low precipitation, but of the order of 400 millimeters a year. But because we have this long winter, we have a lot of snow accumulation, and then the snowmelt in the spring injects a large amount of water into the system, recharging the soils, the groundwater, the ponds, and the streams. So this is a critical component, or the critical component of the hydrology. Here is a pond at Saint Denis, and this is in spring of 2013, and you can see we're in the pond measuring water levels. And again, another pond. This is pond 109, and this is in the early spring. So the snow has just melted, the crops have not yet developed, and the pond is full of water. And this pond has been full of water since I moved to Canada in 2011, and before that as well. You can see it's got lots of trees around the outside, and those trees are dead or dying at this point anyway. And but in 2021, this year, where we've had this dry and hot summer, this pond for the first time in 15 years has dried out completely, and it now looks like this. Trees around the outside are completely dead at this point and decaying. And it looks like perhaps the pond is full of salt, but it's actually not salt. If you look very closely, it's kind of dead algae. But anyway, quite dramatic to see this pond that was formerly full of water all the time now completely empty. And we have data record for this pond going back to '68. And what you see is in the early decades, it used to dry out every year. So the blue lines here is the water in the summer. The gray areas are where the water was held over through the winter to the next year. And so in the early decades, the ponds used to dry out regularly. Then in the early 2000s, we had a massive drought, 4-year drought that massively impacted the prairies, massive hit on agriculture. And then in the mid 2000s, it started to get wetter. And then in the 2010s, it got unprecedentedly wet. And it's been completely full of water, that pond, for the last decade until this year. So this is just basically showing you how variable the climatic conditions are in the prairies, where we have this very delicate balance between precipitation and evaporation. Here's the precipitation again, and in 2021, so you see the very severe drought conditions where we had very low rainfall in the early 2000s. And we're not there yet at this time now. In 2021, we still had quite a decent amount of rainfall, but it was low, but not unprecedentedly low to cause that pond to dry out. And in fact, if you look at the distribution of rainfall, a lot of the rainfall we had in 2021 came in August and September. So it was a very dry early summer. Just to show you a quick view of some of the data that we have at the site. So we've got long-term, well, observations of water content since 2013, which look like this. They're very strongly impacted by the freeze-thaw processes at the site. If you integrate that with depth to get the storage, then you can see that the storage in the top meter, soil moisture storage in the top meter, is actually declining in the recent years and reflecting this kind of drought condition that we're in. We've got a transect instrumented with piezometers to measure the water table. And here's that water table data. This is not a model. This is a data in this cross section. And what you see, and the blue area here is the frozen soil zone. And so we've got hourly measurements of the water table. And what you see is that when the soils thaw, as you'll see in a moment, the water table jumps up beneath the depressions before it jumps up in the middle. And that's what we call depression focus recharge. Interesting process. I know I'm out of time, so I'm going to skip this. Just showing you water content and water table, soil temperature data, which lets us plot the 0-degree isotherm. That's the depth of freezing. Very variable, right? This is how deep the soil freezes. In 2016, the soil froze to less than 20 centimeters. In 2018, it froze to more than 1 meter. So very variable, complicated process, and it strongly controls the hydrological processes. No time to talk about the groundwater, but it's important as well. So just to summarize, basically, St. Denis is a long-term observatory where we have really nice data sets from the prairies of soil moisture, temperature, groundwater, pond levels, snow, precipitation, and all met variables. It's a vulnerable site because it's seasonally frozen and semi-arid, so small changes can have large impacts. But the groundwater interactions are also very important, and they mitigate against the vulnerability of some of the lower lying wetlands. So that was it. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew, for this nice presentation and showing us the site. The next presenter will be Dr. Michelle Newcomer. She's a research scientist at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Michelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. So today I'm going to talk about my research of hydrological and chemical resilience to compounding wildfire, and I would like to acknowledge my collaborators on this from Sonoma Water and the U.S. Geological Survey. In 2017, a sweeping overnight firestorm occurred across urban, forested, and agricultural areas in Northern California. In this watershed, it's called the Russian River Watershed, over 21 fires occurred simultaneously overnight. And you can see here a picture of one of the cities called Santa Rosa. This is one of the urban areas that burned. And this is the before and after picture of that overnight fire. Over 8,000 structures were damaged, 44 people were killed, and over 14.5 billion in insured losses occurred. So the Russian River Watershed, it's located along the coast of Northern California, and it's a Mediterranean climate system with millennia of fire history. I have 3 main research questions for my work addressing fire within this watershed. First, how do compounding fire events impact the hydrological, the chemical, and microbial conditions of the river corridor network? Second, what hydrobiogeochemical metrics are critical indicators of watershed resilience and potential thresholds? And third, can such data be used to identify critical resilience tipping points and potential co-benefits of fire in landscapes? So to address these research questions, within days of the fires, I worked with Sonoma Water and collaborators at the USGS to lead and launch a watershed scale nested hierarchical investigation of wildfire impacts on water quality. So this work specifically addresses how those compounding fires will impact future water supply and water quality. Here is a map of the Russian River watershed located in north of the San Francisco Bay Area. And so beginning in 2017, we've really seen a new fire every single year. And the map on the left shows the different fire years, and the colors represent the different fires that have occurred and the years in which they occurred. Our stream sampling sites are shown by the green dots, and they're labeled by their names. So we have a total of 15 sites across the watershed. For each of these sample sites, we used an application from the USGS called StreamStats to define the unique sub-drainage boundaries and to calculate fire coverage statistics. So I'll give you an example of one of these watersheds called Dry Creek, DRYCR. This is a sub-watershed that was our control watershed until 2020. And in 2020, a fire occurred within our control watershed. At each of these sites, we collected physical, chemical, and biological variables, including a suite of water quality, cations, anions, organic carbon, nitrogen, sediment and water DNA, and pore water chemistry from a set of cryocores. We also utilized the wealth of watershed baseline data sets from networks such as the US Geological Survey and NWIS database and the CDEN database, which is a California database. So this represented over 15,000 data points and spatial data layers that exist for this watershed. So here are some initial findings. These are some findings for nitrate. And what we're looking at are on the x-axis, on the left, it's groundwater. So groundwater values, both historical and post-fire groundwater, the concentration of nitrate. And the yellow is the historical surface water. And then the other categories represent the percentage of the drainage area that has burned. And they also represent the year. So the green being 1 year post-fire and the blue being 2 years post-fire. So our findings show that the magnitude and the duration of nitrate changes are proportional to the fire severity and the extent, with higher nitrate values observed in the high fraction burn areas with statistically significant differences between the different groups. We note, however, that even though we do see statistically significant differences, that these values are still well within the range of the historical values, suggesting that there is some level of resilience that exists within this landscape. So despite the catastrophic nature and extent of these fires occurring year after year, we find little evidence of fire-related shifts in hydrology, nutrients, metals, and microbial communities, and we're finding remarkable resiliency of the system to buffer change. So here is a quick glimpse of some of what we are finding for these other chemical constituents. And this figure shows differences in trends of different chemical values for temperature, chromium, inorganic nitrogen, calcium. And they show the trends before the fire, shown in orange, and then after the fire, shown in green. And some of them have an increasing trend, some of them show a decreasing trend, some of them are statistically significant, and some of them are not. And so what this indicates, just take alkalinity, for example. Alkalinity increased after the fires, but it was not a statistically significant increase, while chloride, for example, decreased. So this figure, the second figure I have here shows a scatter plot of resilience versus resistance. And this figure shows the scatter density of the values. And the main takeaway from this is that in the high burn areas, those are the only areas that showed a shift downwards in resilience, while the other areas that experienced less than 50% burn really showed a temporal resiliency to these fires. So with that, I will thank you all for your time and also encourage you to please reach out to me with questions and visit some of our websites shown here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelle, for the very nice study and for showing your site. So the next speaker will be Xiaoxu. He's a professor at the Chinese Academy of Science. Please start with the presentation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to be here. Okay, I'm from the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and I would introduce the lowest critical zone observatory at the Wangungu Waterslide, and which is a part of the Chinese Ecosystem Research Network. At this site, we aim to advance our understanding of the hydrological and the biogeochemical response to various land use and management changes. And the Chinese Laurier Plateau is the largest Laurier deposit in the world in terms of both depth and area. And the mean thickness of the Laurier deposit across the entire plateau is more than 100 meters. And there are various landforms across the plateau with different erosion magnitudes. And Chinese Laurier Plateau is considered to be one of the most severely eroded areas in the world. In recent decades, is undergoing significant changes in land use types and management practices. For example, with the implementation of the Green for Green project in 1999, slope farmland was converted to forest, shrub, or grassland, and particularly in some cultivation areas, the cropland to orchards conversion has rapidly expanded due to its financial benefits. Because of the low precipitation and the deep groundwater level in the Laurier Plateau, soil water plays a very important role in maintaining ecosystem services and functions. However, newly introduced vegetation, such as the black locust from the North America, usually consumes more soil moisture than the native plants do. So rapidly depleting local soil moisture resources and leading to the formation of a dry soil layer in the deep soil profile. As known, the small old trees are often seen in the plateau due to the high soil drought, where some 30-year-old forest trees grow only to about 20% of their normal height. So the soil hydrological processes in the Laurier critical zone to land use change is a very important issue in this region. And the coupled hydrological biogeochemical processes are quite sensitive to land use and management changes. Vegetation restoration with exotic plant species could not only alter soil hydrological process, but also affect the soil carbon and nitrogen cycles, partly because of the changes in deep root distribution and some management practices. For example, the root growth, the blue bars shows the root growth and the artificial trees, such as the apple orchards or the black locust, could reach about 16 meters after 18 years growth. So the changes in land use or management will alter the hydrological biogeochemical processes in the region. So to address some those scientific issues, a Laurier critical zone observatory named the Wangungu Waterslide was established in 2015. The observatory facilitates hydrometeorological observations and global change control experiments, runoff measurements, and indoor laboratory for sample analysis. The hydrometeorological observation systems are composed of biflux and radiation observation system and wind profiler radar. And in the subsurface, soil moisture, soil temperature, and electric conductivity at different depths are also measured with the hydroprobe sensors. And we also measure soil moisture at a moderate scale by using the Cosmos. And here are some pictures showing the detailed field observations, such as the water balance plots in a selected slope with different land use types, and the runoff monitoring of the waterside, and the cross-borehole GPR for soil water transport studies, and the comparative observations of soil and water processes. And besides, the borehole drilling was from the land surface to bedrock was also conducted in the waterside, and the drilling depth is more than 200 meters, and the physical and the chemical properties of the loess samples were also analyzed in the lab. Now I'd like to discuss some results and findings. First, based on the observations of deep soil moisture content and the soil hydrologic model, we observed the long-term variations of soil moisture in response to land use change. 5 stages of soil moisture dynamics were detected, including the formation process of the dry soil layer in the soil profile and the recovery of soil moisture with land use change. And in our most recent work, we also quantified the fate of nitrate in deep soil induced by agricultural land use change. We found that high nitrate accumulation in the Weddell Stone after land use change from croplands to orchards, and the isotopic data indicated that accumulated nitrate in the Weddell Stone are mainly from the manure and the sewage, followed by the soil nitrogen and chemical fertilizers nitrogen. So the transition from croplands to orchards could result in high nitrate accumulation in the deep Weddell Stone in the region. As is well known, the denitrification process sometimes is very weak in the arid and the semi-arid regions because of aerobic conditions and the low availability of soil organic carbon. So nitrate may persist for a long time in the Weddell Zone and may gradually travel downward to the groundwater. We calculated the residence time of nitrate in the Weddell Zone by using the chloride mass balance method. And the residence time of nitrate in the Weddell Zone ranges from decades to hundreds and even thousands of years, which largely depends on the thickness of the Weddell Zone and the soil texture and the management practices. So thick Weddell Zone plays a very important role in regulating the terrestrial nitrogen stores and the groundwater pollution by nitrate under agriculture land use changes. And about the future research, first, buried soils at the deep depths contain lots of paleo-environment information. So hydrobiogeochemical dynamics such as water, nutrients, carbon, and microbial activities in such soils should be further explored from the surface down to the bedrock. And like other CZOs, the hydraulic cycles in the atmosphere, vegetation, soil, groundwater system need to be quantified and predicted by using model data integration, especially for those disturbed by human activities. And the knowledge we learned from the Lois CZO, as well as those unsolved questions, are transferable, definitely transferable to other parts of the world, such as the Lois Hills of Western Elva or the Argentina Lois. So international efforts on data sharing, model building, or comparable studies are currently considered actually by our teams. So, and with this group photo, I'd like to finish my talk. And thank you. Welcome to China's Loess Plateau.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Xiaoxu. So last but not least comes Nicolas Brüggemann. He's a professor at the Forschungszentrum Jülich. Please take the floor, Nicolas.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the invitation. A very nice format. Just sharing my screen. I hope you can see it, and then yeah. Okay, so I will present data of the impact of 3 consecutive dry years on spruce forest in the northern Eifel, Germany, in western Germany, and I also would like to acknowledge my contributors to this work, to this joint effort. So where are we? We are in the west of Germany here, labeled as Eifel Lower Rhine Valley Observatory in the so-called Torino network. And in this watershed, we have a hilly region in the south of this watershed, and where you see the red arrow, we did the study which we started last year. The idea was to investigate potential lag effects of 3 consecutive hot and dry summers in 2018 to 2020 on forest ecosystem functions, mainly on fluxes with the atmosphere, exchange fluxes with the atmosphere, and particularly the dieback of the forests due to bark beetle attack in these 3 years has led to massive clear cuttings, and clear cuttings in turn have made many forest areas much more prone to storm damage and leading to further damage of the forest area. You can see here some images of the affected forest land. And then also you see in small here our instrumentation also with eddy covariance and other instruments. So first we started with a satellite-based survey of spruce mortality in this region, and you can see here on the picture on the right in the different colors. In red, you see areas that are basically already dead. Yellow, you see damaged areas that are at the warning stage. And in green, you see still more or less healthy areas, but you see that already quite a significant portion of this area has been affected. This data from last year, so this year it's already even more affected. And this analysis was based on Google Earth Engine data. So we chose a site that has a clear-cut area that, or has a clear-cut area that has evolved at different stages. So there's one area already cut in 2018, and then another area where the cutting continued in 2019 and 20. You see here on the right, thermal image, the surface temperature, and you see that especially in the fresh clear-cut areas, you have much higher surface temperatures than in still more or less healthy forest here in blue. If we look at the climatic water balance at this location, we see that particularly in the summer 2020, which was a very dry summer, we had negative climatic water balance with down to minus 200 millimeters, recovering until the end of the calendar year. We here stopped the calculation after 1 year of measurements, which we started at May 28 in the year 2020. And so you see that basically this site has recovered, and this year was a relatively wet year. But still we saw these, or still see these strong effects of the drought on the forest. We also looked at soil moisture, both with the mobile cosmic ray neutron rover system and also stationary system. And we saw the driest period in the soil in September 2020. which you can see here reflected in the highest count of the neutrons, epithermal neutrons, because this is delivering information about soil water content, because these neutrons are moderated, meaning attenuated by soil water. Also, in the larger area, we saw this strong decline in soil moisture here on the left in June 2020, where the wider area was very dry. And in end of October 2020, it had recovered slightly, but still you see areas that are quite dry. Now looking at the CO2 and water vapor fluxes, on the left, we see the net ecosystem exchange of carbon dioxide. And we see in yellow that the fresh clear-cut area where we started the measurement last year released about 4.5 tons of carbon, CO2 carbon per hectare in this 1 year, whereas the intact forest with which we compared it at another station about 30 kilometers away took up about the same amount of carbon dioxide. We also compared it with a clear-cut area that was clear-cut in 2013, and even after 8 years, this area is still a small net source of CO2 over 1 year of measurements, at least last year. This year, we still are continuing to monitor. Also, if you look at evapotranspiration, you see that there's a negative feedback to the atmosphere because the clear-cut area releases much less water to the atmosphere. So if you translate this difference here of about 230 millimeters it's 147 millimeters between the clear-cut and the forest, intact forest, and convert that to cubic meters per hectare, you see that this is a massive amount of less water release as water vapor to the atmosphere. And this is now reflecting the two feedbacks of such clear-cut areas to the atmosphere. On the one hand, you have a positive feedback on the greenhouse gas balance due to net release of CO2. On the other hand, a strong positive feedback to warming due to less evapotranspiration. So if we summarize the 3 dry years, 2018 to 2020, led to a widespread drastic decrease of soil moisture in especially the growing season. This in turn led to increased susceptibility of especially the coniferous forest to bark beetle attack, and also large-scale dieback, followed by widespread clear cutting because the forest owners are usually cutting then their forest. These clear cuttings in turn increase the susceptibility to further bark beetle infestation and also to storm damage, which we also observed in this area. And these areas become a net source of CO2 for many years, at least a decade, and release several tons of carbon dioxide carbon per hectare per year into the atmosphere. And in addition, these clear-cut areas drastically increase the heat release to the atmosphere and thereby have a strong positive feedback on the warming. So if I finally address briefly these questions that were sent around, yes, we have observed an increasing frequency and intensity of drought, not so much wildfires, but drought. Then we have mostly the pest infestation, bark beetles mainly for coniferous trees and fungi mainly for the deciduous trees. We have strong interaction with storm damage, and we are in contact with local forest owners and managers by information exchange and compare it with other forest and clear-cut sites that are run by us currently, and we'll also compare it with other sites in the larger area. Okay, thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Nicolas, for this very nice presentation, and also to all the other presenters. So, are there any questions, Claire, you want to start with?
Sure, yeah, I think there was a few questions that were in the Q&A and chat, but I think that they've been dealt with. I have a few questions that occurred to me just listening to these varied talks, very different landscapes. And it seems like several of them are, heavily managed landscapes. So Saint Denis with agriculture, Russian River, you mentioned some urban areas, China Low West Plateau, agriculture, and then forestry in Northern Eifel. I think maybe Scotty Creek is the only one that's maybe doesn't have management going on. And I'm just wondering, some of you did touch on it a little bit, but I'm wondering if you could expand on whether or not this management exacerbates the impacts of the disturbances that you were discussing. So Michelle, I know it was wildfire, and the other one's talking a little bit about drought conditions. What role does management play in these landscapes?
So I'll just begin very briefly and say that the role of management is quite important. For the Russian River watershed, we saw many of the agricultural fields actually act as buffers to the fires, whereas others, they burn quite significantly, but specifically the wine region part of this watershed, it remained relatively intact. Now, how this actually translates to watershed scale changes, that's where we're finding some of those interesting and confounding results that, despite all of this, despite the catastrophic nature, we're not seeing those changes. And so what this is pointing back to is really the importance of the watershed mechanisms, the watershed biogeochemical cycling from the bedrock through the vegetation that's buffering that change.
Nick, go on.
I just wanted to comment on that with respect to management. In the forests in Germany, management plays a very strong role because basically none of the forests in Germany is still native. So, natively this would be deciduous forest, mixed deciduous forest. Since 200 years, it's managed, and the spruce had been introduced by the Prussians that came to the western part of Germany. And since then, the spruce is, let's say, grown at large scale. For many decades, that went quite well. But now with increasing length and intensity of droughts, spruce is definitely not adapted to this, especially at low altitude, at these lower altitude or lower elevations. And therefore, management basically is the origin of the susceptibility of these forests to drought. And now both public and private forest owners have recognized this problem and are now trying to return to a more natural mixture of tree species, especially deciduous tree species. But that takes, of course, several decades.
Andrew, any thoughts on the agricultural activity and what impact that might have on, for example, that pond that you showed?
Yeah, well, in the prairies, we've got quite an interesting history because the land was settled by Europeans 100 or so years ago, and through that process, it's been very drastically changed from grassland, native grasslands to cropped lands, and also that one of the things that has been done extensively is drainage. So you dig a ditch between two wetlands and you drain the water out so that you can cultivate the land. And that's potentially having massive hydrological impacts. So there are things like Devil's Lake in North Dakota, where you see multi-decadal rises in the water level, probably because of the fact that we've been draining the landscape. And of course, so native grasses are adapted to the climate here, and they are very good at transpiring a lot of the water out. They transpire more than a crop would. And so when you go from native grass to crop, what you see is you get more water on the landscape, so less evaporative losses. And so when you go back to grassland, you can actually start drying out wetlands again. So yeah, it's very sensitive to that, and it's extensively modified landscape.
I'm not seeing any other questions right now in the Q&A or chat, so I do have something else I was thinking about if we have time. Bhavna, do you think we have enough time here?
Yeah, we do have like 2 to 3 minutes, and you know, I'm gonna jump in here really quickly because you gave me an opportunity to talk. But I found so much synergies between all the talks that were presented. Like I heard everybody say we are seeing changes in the hydrological cycle. We are seeing declines either in soil moisture or the amount of water that we have and how much you know, and we're seeing this in the community a lot with the intensification of the hydrological cycles. So I wanted everybody to comment on what they're seeing in terms of the biogeochemistry. I saw a few talks touching on the nitrogen and increased accumulation with fire. I know, Michelle, you talked about, and the Chinese sites, I think you talked about how the changes with the orchard and crop also saw these, you know, changes to the nitrogen story. But I'm just, you know, going to put this out there. Are you seeing other biogeochemical changes that might be synergistic with the others? Very open-ended question. Michelle.
Yes, Bhavna, thank you for that question. I'll make 2 points here. First, regarding the hydrological cycle. What's super interesting is that we're finding very little change in the hydrological cycle after these fires. Now, this is a complicated system because it's also compounded by drought and atmospheric rivers. So it's fluctuating from year to year. So really teasing out that fire effect has been difficult, but thus far we haven't seen any increases in the runoff ratio, for example. The other thing I'd like to point out is we have seen some changes in metals. So when we think about mercury, for example, we have seen increased loading of mercury and iron and lead and chromium. So those particular elements are coming from watersheds where there's very specific geology. So the fires are liberating some of those natural elements from the system. So I think that's another part of the story, like the metal biogeochemical cycling that we need to dig into more.
I want to put Bill on the spot if possible. Are you seeing any like carbon changes so far where you are at your site with the increased hydrological connectivity?
Yeah, so I mean, it introduces a new pathway, and you know, moving through the pathway is water, but everything that water is carrying as well. So there's a a new initiative to complement the tower vertical fluxes of carbon dioxide and methane with aqueous fluxes of carbon species, and that's you know, sort of just started up. I would think there's definitely people that I would direct you toward, David Olefeld at University of Alberta and Oliver Sonnentag at University of Montreal would be ones that I would direct you to. Others have looked at, you know, we just heard Michelle mention mercury. There's been also some work into that. I know I'm changing subjects a bit, but there does seem to be a role that permafrost thaw plays in methylation, changing the environment so that methylation of mercury occurs more readily. It's a bit of a complex environment, though. I mean, the methyl mercury breaks down photochemically, and it's a long way to the outlet. And there's a number of lakes en route, so there's you know, evolution and devolution of processes as along the flow path, and that work's also being, you know, sort of in the midst of some of that work as well. It's a big issue with the communities, I can tell you that, and having NASA above on site with makes the carbon brings a lot of focus and attention on the carbon cycling as well.
Other thoughts?
Well, I mean, nutrient cycling is, of course, a big issue in the prairies, as it probably is in everybody's area. And just to say, you know, it's also exacerbated by drainage. So when you start shedding the water off the landscape, and it carries the nutrients with it, and you get this eutrophication events in the large receiving water bodies. So it's a big concern, but I can't really say much about what's happening on site.
Great, thanks. Claire? do you want to end or?
Yeah, it looks like we're right on the hour, so I don't want to, I don't know if Julia's going to let us keep talking. There's never enough time.
If you had an outstanding question,
Yeah.
maybe you could.
Okay, sure.
Julia just came on. Yeah.
I'll just go for it. So Michelle, you were the main one who touched on wildfire, but Bill, you did sort of mention it came up. I assume there are fires that have gone through the area or around the area. You know, when you mentioned the the trees dying, I had, maybe there's excess fuel there. But my question is really, when you look at the impacts of wildfire, and these are two really different landscapes, different climate, everything's different about them. Is there any benefit to comparing the impacts of wildfire in two such distinctly different places? Or do you think you really need to, if you're going to do any cross-site comparisons, do they need to be in the same landscape to really learn more?
Michelle, do you want to go ahead?
Sure, I'll say briefly. Yeah, my answer would be yes, most definitely. I think there's information from each unique watershed that can help you think about how landscapes respond to fire. And there's a gradient. We're finding that there is it's not either catastrophic or not catastrophic, but there's a range of conditions. In the Russian River watershed, there's millennia of fire history, cultural burning, natural wildfires, human-induced fires. So the fires, as they are naturally in the landscape, it's part of the functioning. So I think that to examine that, to really acknowledge that there are some ecosystems that are fire adapted and need fire to function, I think that's an important comparison to make with other watersheds.
Interesting.
I agree with that. I think just thinking of what Scotty Creek could contribute, and I think one of the things is that it does give sort of an off-the-grid sort of wildfire scenario if it's not if the fire is left to burn and go through its course. It does provide somewhat of a a reference point, I guess, for natural events. I mean, our focus is really on the impact of fire to change the energy balance on permafrost thaw and how it can accelerate or even decelerate thaw in some cases. And then we compare it with an adjacent landscape which doesn't have permafrost. So it is a big jump, what you're proposing, but I think, setting our sights on those kinds of comparisons are very worthwhile, and kind of forces us to think, in my case anyway, beyond just the next wetland, but also to the larger region and also at continental scales as well.
Thank you. All right, I think we're good to wrap up now. We've gone a little bit past time. Bhavna, is that okay with you? Okay. I just wanted to draw everyone's attention to, well, first, thank you to all our presenters and the audience for putting some questions in the Q&A. And thank you to CUAHSI for hosting. And also just wanted to put a shout out for next week's cyber seminar. So next Tuesday, September 21st, same time. It's the 5th installment, and its focus is on lakes, wetlands, and streams, which many of the people who spoke today deal with as well. So lots of synergy across all of our seminars. So hopefully people can join next week.
Great, thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a nice day. Bye-bye.